There is a fence line outside LaPorte, Indiana, where the ground still remembers the weight of a machine that hasn't turned a wheel since 1938. Somewhere under the fescue, a scrap dealer's ledger from that year lists a Rumely OilPull by serial number and nothing else. The tractor is gone. The green paint, Rumely forest green with the wheels done in a deep barn red, went to rust decades ago on some other example that survived, 3 counties over, in a shed nobody's opened since harvest. The company that built it stopped existing under its own name in 1931. LaPorte still stands. The factory does not build tractors in it anymore. Almost nothing does. This is the story of Rumely, the company that convinced American farmers to trust an engine that ran on nothing more refined than kerosene, and then vanished so completely that most people who drive past its old factory today have no idea what was built there. Rumely Forest Green was never as famous as International Harvester's Red or Alice Chalmers' Orange, and that is part of the tragedy of this story. It was a working color, not a showroom color, a deep, near black green that farmers chose to associate with the oil pull's most unglamorous virtue. It did not overheat, it did not sip expensive refined fuel, and it did not quit in a field in July. When you saw that green machine idling at a threshing bee with its enormous flywheel turning lazily and its exhaust ticking over almost silent, you knew the man running it was pulling more grain through more belt than anyone else on the section that day. Meinrad Rumely came to Indiana from Baden in the German states in 1848, a young blacksmith with almost nothing. By 1853, he had set up a small machine shop in LaPorte, a town of a few thousand people at the edge of the prairie, and started building threshing machines for the farmers clearing the surrounding land. The company grew slowly and honestly through the 1860s and 1870s, the way most Midwestern implement makers did, one satisfied customer at a time, one county fair demonstration at a time. By the 1880s, M. Rumely Company was building steam traction engines, the great coal and wood-fired behemoths that hauled threshing rigs from farm to farm across the Corn Belt. Meinrad Rumely died in 1904, and it was his successors, under the direction of his son-in-law and the engineering talent the company had assembled, who made the decision that would define Rumely for the next quarter century. Steam was heavy, thirsty, and dangerous. Gasoline engines of the era were finicky and prone to overheating under sustained field load. Rumely's engineers, led by John Secor, wanted something in between. An internal combustion engine that could burn cheap, low-grade kerosene instead of refined gasoline, and that could survive the punishing, hours-long pulls of a threshing season without boiling itself dry. Their answer, introduced in 1910, was the OilPull. The name was not marketing flourish. It described the machine's most important patent. Rather than cooling the engine with water, which would flash to steam and require constant refilling, the OilPull circulated oil through its massive radiator. Oil could run far hotter than water without boiling, which meant the engine could burn the cheap, hard-to-ignite kerosene farmers already used for their lamps at a fraction of the cost of gasoline. The very first production model, the Type A, was a 25-45 horsepower giant that weighed close to 9 tons. It looked less like the streamlined tractors of the 1930s and more like a steam engine that had quietly swapped its firebox for a cylinder block. Farmers who bought one in those first years were not buying a convenience. They were buying insurance against the one thing that ruined a threshing season faster than weather, an engine that quit under load. What happened next was the decision that every implement dealer in the Wabash Valley had hoped for and half expected for a decade. In 1911, Rumely merged with the Advance Thresher Company of Battle Creek, Michigan, forming Advance Rumely, and for the next 15 years, the new company would become one of the largest and most respected full-line manufacturers in American agriculture. It arrived exactly as the market had wanted it to. If there is one machine that represents Rumely at its absolute peak, farm historians and oil pull collectors point to the Type E, the 3060, introduced in the early 1910s and refined across a production run that stretched into the early 1920s. It was rated at roughly 30 drawbar horsepower and 60 belt horsepower, numbers that meant, in practice, that a single Type E could run the largest threshing separators built at the time without slowing down, and could pull a full gang of plows through Iowa gumbo soil that would have stalled a lighter machine. A new Type E in the mid-1910s cost a farmer somewhere in the range of $2,700 to $3,000, an enormous sum, equivalent to what a modest farm family might earn in 2 or 3 years. And it was usually bought not by a single household, but by a neighborhood, a threshing ring of 6 or 8 farms that pooled the cost and shared the machine season to season. Restored examples that survive today, and only a few hundred oil pulls of any type still exist in running order, change hands at antique tractor auctions for anywhere from $15,000 to well over $40,000, depending on model and condition. A small fortune for a machine that was, in its own time, essentially industrial equipment. What farmers remembered about running an oil pull, according to oral histories collected by county historical societies across Indiana and Illinois, was the sound and the patience of the thing. It did not rev, it thumped, low and slow, at speeds that felt almost too gentle to be doing real work. And then it simply did not stop doing that work, hour after hour, all day, all season, while lighter gasoline tractors around it needed babying. One farmer interviewed decades later for a Wabash Valley Agricultural Heritage Project recalled that his father used to say the oil pull didn't have any hurry in it and didn't need any. That was the whole sales pitch, and for a decade, it worked better than almost anything else on the market. This was the era when the green machine on a farm meant something specific to the neighbors. An oil pull farm was a farm that could be trusted to finish threshing on schedule. It was a reputation as much as a possession. There is a document in the company's surviving corporate records that shows exactly when Advance Rumely's fortunes turned, and the date on it is earlier than most people assume. It was not the Great Depression that broke Rumely. It was the agricultural depression that began nearly a decade before Wall Street collapsed. American farm income had spiked during the First World War, when European agriculture was devastated and American grain fed the continent. Farmers borrowed heavily against high wartime land values to expand and to buy exactly the kind of large, expensive machinery Rumely built. Then, starting in 1920, commodity prices fell by nearly half in the space of a single year as European production came back online and wartime demand evaporated. Farmland values, which had roughly doubled in the preceding decade, began a long collapse. By the mid-1920s, thousands of Midwestern farms were in foreclosure or forced sale every year, a full decade before the Dust Bowl and the bank failures most people associate with agricultural ruin. Advance Rumely had built its entire product line, massive, expensive, built-to-last machines aimed at prosperous, expanding farms, for exactly the customer base that was now disappearing fastest. The company that had thrived by selling the biggest, most capable tractor a threshing ring could buy found itself with almost no customers left who could buy anything at all. The final restructuring meeting of Advance Rumely's board in the spring of 1931 reportedly lasted less than an afternoon. Machinery that had once outfitted entire counties was being liquidated for a fraction of its production cost, and the men in that room, according to company histories, understood there was no path back. Advance Rumely was acquired by Alice Chalmers in June of 1931, and the oil pull name, along with the Dual and other Rumely tractor lines that had followed it, was retired within a few years. The company that had once been among the largest implement makers in the country ceased to exist as an independent name. LaPorte, Indiana today is a town of roughly 22,000 people, a little smaller than it was at Advance Rumely's peak, when the company was among the largest employers in the county, and its factory complex sprawled across dozens of acres near the rail lines. Portions of the old Rumely works continued in industrial use for decades under different owners. Other sections were eventually cleared or repurposed. Drive through LaPorte now, and you will find a historical marker, a small museum collection maintained by local preservation groups, and streets that still carry the name. but very little that a Rumely engineer from 1915 would recognize as the place he worked. The last oil pull badge tractor is generally understood to have come off the line in the very early 1930s, before the Alice Chalmers takeover fully absorbed the brand, though exact final production records are contested among historians, which is itself a small measure of how. Somewhere tonight in a pole barn in northern Indiana or eastern Illinois, a Rumely OilPull Type E is having its ignition timed ahead of next season's steam and gas engine show. The man doing the timing likely didn't learn it from a manual. Oil pulls do not respond well to modern intuition, and the handful of people who still know how to properly start and run one learned by standing next to someone who already knew. Groups like the Rumely Collectors News keep a registry of surviving machines, and gatherings such as the Rolag Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion and the LaPorte County Historical Society's own events still bring a handful of these green giants out into daylight every summer, their flywheels turning at the same unhurried pace they always did. The company that built them has not existed in any meaningful form for nearly a century. The knowledge of how to run them lives only in the people who keep showing up to try. The disappearance of Rumely was never really about oil-cooled radiators or kerosene engines, clever as those were. It was about a way of running a farm that depended on a neighborhood pooling its resources for one very large, very capable machine. A way of life that assumed farms would keep growing, keep needing more horsepower, keep being worth borrowing against. When that assumption broke in the 1920s, years before most of the country noticed anything was wrong, it broke the company that had built its entire future on it. The green paint did not vanish from the landscape because the engineering failed. It vanished because the neighborhoods that shared those tractors and the credit that let them buy them disappeared first. That is the real obituary here, not the factory in LaPorte, the threshing ring itself. If your grandfather ever talked about a green tractor that didn't have any hurry in it, or if you've ever stood next to one at a county fair and wondered why it sounded nothing like anything else running that day, the next story in this series is one you'll want to hear.